Well, welcome everyone. It's good to have you here. I am John Kroll. I'm the director of Franklin College's Pulliam School of Journalism and the publisher of the StateHouseFile.com, a news website powered by Franklin College journalism students. We have a great panel to talk about really how we take care of ourselves when we're reporting on difficult stories. As you probably can tell, I hurried over here, so I'm a little bit winded. I'm going to let the panelists introduce themselves. Jamie, I'll start with you.
Okay, well, it's afternoon now. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Jamie Bromley. I have been at Franklin College. This is starting my 15th year. I'm a professor of psychology. I'm chair of the psychology department. And in my previous life, before teaching here, I was a clinician, so I was a licensed psychologist. So I had about probably 15 years of clinical experience before coming to teach, and I've been teaching full-time since then. So I'm a little bit out of the clinical world, but I spend a lot of time teaching students who are going into the clinical world. So I teach clinical and counseling related classes, a lot of research and statistics. And so even in that role, I try to promote self-care for our students as they go into the field. It's important to kind of learn these habits early.
Hi, I'm Sarah Kinder. I'm the Director of Counseling here at Franklin College, and I have been here almost 9 years, formerly in our counselor role, and then a couple years here as the Director.
And I'm Kent Huber. I've been in the counseling field for almost 25 years, dealt with many kinds of trauma, but I've been trying to find that journalist in my past who I counseled with trauma. So I didn't come up with that person, but multiple types of trauma. I'm currently serving as behavioral health manager at Major Health Partners, which is in Shelbyville, Indiana, about 30 minutes away from here, and looking forward to speaking with you today.
Afternoon, my name's Steve Black. I am a 1999 graduate of Franklin College and glad to be back here. I am the Director of Behavioral Health Care over at Major Health Partners, but if you need counseling advice, I will point to all of them. I'm a physical therapist by background, but I've been a healthcare administrator over large hospitals and also spent a lot of my career mentoring and training up young professionals, and self-care is a big part of what we talk about because it affects all of us, and so I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Well, part of the reason we are doing this is because we have learned for a long time. I'm also an alum of Franklin College, graduate some years before you. We won't go into that. And when I entered the profession, the thinking when you went out and had to cover something that was just truly god-awful was that you were just supposed to rub a little bit of dirt on it and get back in the game. Every other profession out there is now understanding the effect that trauma can have on the human beings who have to do the work that they do. And part of what we're going to talk about today is I hope, some basic steps. And I should say this is not a question that is remote to college students. If you were just over, Alex Walters didn't go to college planning to cover a mass shooting. One of our former students will be on a panel tonight, Emily Ketterer, didn't plan to cover the arrest of a college president on sex crimes charges, and then as soon as she got out of college, pretty much have to cover a mass shooting just up the road from where she lived at the Greenwood Park Mall. So we're learning that we have to do more to prepare all journalists, but mostly young journalists, to care for themselves. And I think I'd like to start this conversation. And I should say, we're not going to stand on protocol. We're not going to wait until 15 minutes before the end of the session to take questions. If you have a question that comes up, throw your hand up. The reason I'm using a handheld mic is that I will come to you. That's the only way the people who are listening online can hear the question. And we'll frame it and we'll deal with it right then. Okay? So, Jamie, I'm going to start with you. If you could just talk about some practical steps people could do if they've been sent out to cover something awful, to make sure that they're maintaining their own health.
So I think the most practical thing is to be able to sleep. I think we are a nation of sleep-deprived individuals across the board, and sleep is essential for our psychological functioning. And we pride ourselves on not sleeping, which is really different than other cultures. And we're seeing like long-term significant health problems due to lack of sleep. Research is starting to show the link of lack of sleep to mental health issues, and that it's a precursor. I mean, it's been a symptom for a long time of mental health issues, but now we're seeing it's actually pre-exists a lot of the mental health issues people are struggling. So doing physical self-care and emotional self-care, taking steps to doing that, and getting sleep, is a very important piece of that kind of physical self-care.
And I'm going to offer a word of counsel to our distinguished panel. The mics are designed to move toward you, not you toward the mics. So feel free to pull them in so that you don't have to lean over the table to talk into them. Sarah.
I think just to add on to what Dr. Bromley shared, I think, sleep is of course essential, and this is kind of where I go with students oftentimes with just basic stress, but also traumatic things that they might have experienced recently. Sometimes when we're in those moments and we've experienced trauma, the things that feel most basic, the things that we know we need, that we, don't think of as earth-shattering that's going to help, those are the things that we need. So very much, as she shared, sleep, but also things as simple as water and eating. And honestly, those are the first things that typically go by the wayside for people when they've experienced something traumatic. A lot of times those can affect our appetite, but when we look at our bodies and how our bodies work, you need sleep, you need water, you need food, you need that to have energy to keep going and to really take care of yourself at that most basic level, to even be at a baseline to really start thinking about what to do from that point. So I think just to add on to that, water and food and sleep are the most basic needs that are oftentimes most forgotten as well.
Kent.
I think it's very important to have a basic understanding of trauma. It's an overused word in some ways, and so the definition gets skewed. A lot of times we think of military PTSD, those type of things, but we don't think sometimes of the day-to-day tasks that we go through. I thought the panelists in the earlier discussion did a very good job of saying it's that moment I lost control. And each of them said, I'm trying to pull that back in. And in the line of reporting, you may not report on some of the big issues or have that school shooting that seems to be major, but what about those little things that go along? One of the things that doesn't get talked about is sometimes vicarious trauma, where I may not be at the event, but I read the story, I edited the story, or I listened to someone in that process that eventually became my trauma. Early in my career, I was working with some military individuals who worked in a room in Terre Haute, but controlled drones in the Middle East. And just having that picture, even though they controlled the stick, was enough for them to experience what they would have experienced on the battlefield. So in your line of journalism, be very self-aware. If we have time a little bit, I have a little exercise we might try, just to kind of demonstrate that sometimes we don't realize we're missing sleep, or we don't understand we haven't talked about this to anyone. And I think just understanding the baseline of where is my baseline for being calm and restful versus where am I at today?
Steve.
Yes, great question. I mean, I think on a couple different levels. One, having gone through situations in my career that were unexpected, I think of leading a hospital through 2 years of COVID. I mean, just like the impact of having dozens of more deaths for our staff in 1 year than it had the previous year. For me, it made me really take a step back and think about, what do I really believe about things? What do I believe about leadership? What do I think about things that I had come to assume, or things that I just had come to, I just didn't think on them a whole lot. And so I would say, I tell a lot of young professionals, start thinking on those things now. Start thinking on, what do I believe about the world? What do I believe about painful, harmful things that go on in this world and how they impact me or who I really am as an individual? The more grounded you become in who you really are, your authentic self, then the less I think the less those traumatic events or even through vicarious trauma, those are going to have an impact because you have a grounding already. You're not too young to start that process. And then also it's about the relationships of people around you, surrounding yourselves with people who you can confide in, who you can go to. That's easier said than done. And again, you're not too young to start developing those relationships, those people, trusted individuals you can go to, and you can just release, and they're there to accept that and to just be there with you in that moment. I think along with all the things that have been said, I think those are really healthy starting points.
Steve, I'm going to stay with you because of your background as a physical therapist too, in that, and I'll start with a little bit of autobiography, but I won't make it too long or too painful here. I was a newspaper journalist for the first almost 20 years of my career. And during that time, I became also a competitive triathlete because I looked around the newsroom at a lot of the other veteran journalists, and I started in the era when some of the reporters would still have bottles in their desk drawers and be drinking during the day. Many of them were on their fourth or fifth marriages. There were all sorts of really bad, and I thought, okay, obviously something has to be done to deal with the stresses of the work, even when you're not dealing with something truly traumatic. How much is having a regimen of ongoing, physical maintenance important to preserving your mental health?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think all three of them could speak to how one contributes to the other better than I could, but I just know that when I was your age, I could eat an entire large Papa John's pizza before I went to bed, sleep 4 hours, and I'd feel like a champion the next day. If I did that now, I'd be down for a week, And so it's like you have to realize that at some point this structure starts fading, and so learn to take care of yourself now. Learn to get those rhythms in place where sleeping 8 hours a night it's a really good thing. Eating healthy foods is a really good thing. Making sure that you have those rhythms of healthy exercise and keeping this structure. If this fails, you can't be out there doing the work you need to do. And you only get one of these. And so absolutely, I think it is essential, not to mention all the different chemical interactions that happen when you get a runner's high, when you do things that really are healthy for you. It certainly helps carry you through the day. And so I promote it greatly.
Kent.
Well, I think it is that self-awareness that goes into it. The physical part is huge, because oftentimes one of the things we do is progressive relaxation, where you actually tense up every muscle in your body, and that shows you how tense you are throughout the day if you relax back. Because if I were to ask you, all of you around the room, on a scale of 1 to 10, how relaxed are you? 10 being the most relaxed, you're about to fall asleep. 0 is, I'm about to take a midterm and I'm really nervous. So how many would you put yourself above 5, that I'm really relaxed, I'm headed that way? How many would you say, I'm stressed, I'm headed to the 0? Some of you are willing to admit it, but we lose track of where we're at on that spectrum, because we start to get used to living at a 2 on the high stress level. We get used to those things and we don't notice it within ourselves how important that is. And sometimes exercise gets our mind slowed down and allows us to focus on what am I feeling throughout my body when it comes to that.
Sarah.
I think just going along with that, a lot of times when we talk about these basic things like moving your body and getting physical exercise, it's really important to know that every body is different, and that doesn't mean that we all need to be trained athletes and running every day, but we need to literally just be finding ways to move our bodies in whatever ways it feels good to us. Kind of going back to those basic steps I was talking about on how to care for yourself, moving your body is a part of that, with an asterisk there to whatever your body limits you to do. But finding ways to tap into things that are enjoyable for you. And maybe that's just if you're having a real stressful day and you're real packed for time and you don't have time to go to the gym or run a couple miles, if that's how you see other people are doing that for themselves. But even just turning on a song for you that is enjoyable and it's something that kind of feeds your soul, to just allow yourself to move your body in that way and just kind of dance and Maybe it's going for a walk, getting some fresh air, but it doesn't have to look a certain way that a lot of people, especially with such access to social media, to see how, people strive to be fit and have their body look a certain way. It doesn't have to look like that, but moving your body is essential, and especially when we think about trauma, that can be really helpful in that sort of recovery process too, just moving your body.
Jamie.
Yeah, so one of the things I wanted to talk about, I'm glad you brought that up, John, is so journalists in particular are at higher risk of developing a substance use disorder than the general population. So developing coping skills early on, not using drugs and alcohol as a way to cope with stress is really essential. I mean, that's important for everybody, but journalists in particular, because of the high stress of the job and the potential of, being exposed to multiple traumas throughout your, career. I think it's really important. So hopefully maybe the tide has changed, but this is fairly recent research, so it's still showing that, because a lot of research has looked at journalists and PTSD, but they're also at higher risk for depression as well. So substance use disorders, depression, those tend to go hand in hand as well. So coping skills and activity, moving your body, is one of those kind of coping skills.
And again, if you have questions, throw a hand up and I'll come to you. Sarah, I'm going to start with you and then go to Kent right afterwards. Both of you mentioned that it's important to talk to people when you're experiencing, we say that and often it moves on. With whom should you talk and how should you structure those kinds of conversations?
Yeah, I think that's a great point that you added in there about how to structure those conversations. Quite literally this morning I was having a conversation with a student. It was sort of a walk-in kind of crisis moment with a student, and they were sharing something traumatic, and the response that they received from a friend when they told it to them, which further put them down because then they were sort of being blamed for a role that they were not active in. They didn't do anything. And so I think that's really important to think about. Talking to someone can be really helpful. And I think, a lot of times these come to maybe a friend or a family member, someone that you trust, someone that you go to. But I think something that on top of that can be really helpful, and this is for any conversation, but I think especially in that moment, I think really assessing your need. What is it that I need right now in this moment? How am I feeling? What do I need? And sometimes that need might just be, I need some ventilation. I need to just let it out, and I need someone to listen to me. Because in those moments, what can be really invalidating is if someone hears what you've just shared, and then they want to offer, you should have done this, or you should do this, and are offering advice to you or suggestions when in that moment you are not ready for that, or you don't want that, or you don't need that. And so I think just kind of assessing what your own needs are, and then being able to advocate for yourself in the beginning and saying, this is what I need in this moment. I experienced this, and I'd really like to talk to someone about it. Do you feel like you're in a place where you can listen to me? And just listen. I don't need advice right now. I just need someone to hear me and to just be with me as I talk about this. If you're a person that wants suggestions in that moment or whatever that is, then I think advocating for that too. But really just figuring out what are your needs and then asking for them. And that can be a relief to the person that you're speaking to as well, because it can kind of alleviate any stress that I have to come up with the perfect thing to say. Because more times than not, there's not a perfect thing to say in that moment. It's just being there and feeling that presence of another person who's listening and supporting you.
Kent, I'm going to reframe the question a little bit, because unless you've got something a point where you disagree with Sarah or you want to amplify anything.
Not at all.
And I'm going to bring Jamie in on this too, because the three of you obviously have taken training on how to be on the other side of conversations such as that. Those of you who are going to go into journalism, it's not just that you're going to cover traumatic events, but you're probably going to find that colleagues of yours have. You're going to be on the other side of that conversation when they come back and they've experienced something awful. So we should be figuring out how we can help our colleagues in that process. What are some of the, Sarah said immediately, don't try don't try to prescribe solutions to their problems. But beyond that, in terms of body language and all of that, there are all of these other signals that human beings send. What should you do?
Well, I'm glad you led into that, John. That's great. The first thing I want to mention is the verbiage we use. The power of words in our head can become so much more powerful if we leave them there. One of the characteristics of trauma, it drives it deeper into our memory recesses to where the emotions get buried and we don't connect the emotions sometimes with what actually happened. And so in therapy, we're trying to connect those two again and allow that to be something out here that I can do something with. That's why many times I encourage people to write it down. Even including doing something like what we call a trauma narrative, where you write down what happened and then you do it several times to get to the bottom of what the emotions are. What was I feeling at the moment? What must it have felt like for me when that happened? And now that I can't remember, you noticed on the panels in the last session who were saying, it's strange that I don't remember that, because the brain has buried that. And so the military has something that they call a battle buddy check-in, and here's some good questions that you can use if you are on the other side of that. What is the hardest right now is one question that you could ask somebody. What's the most difficult thing you're going through? What worried you today? What was it that kind of stressed you out? What came back about that instant? It was fascinating to watch the panelists to see their emotional and body language reaction. And sometimes if you're talking to someone, just be aware of that. I think the other thing is don't try to be too strong when you're asking the questions. It's okay to cry with someone who's been through this. It's so early in my counseling career, I think I tried to be, I don't want to ever be surprised, or I don't want to ever, but I've learned to say, let's be real in this moment. And there's times I do say, I can't imagine what it would have been like to be there. But this is what it might have felt like to me. You might ask a person what went well today to help you through this. And simple things like, how are things at home? One of the panelists said, how are you? Was the most powerful question. And beginning to build on that will give you a lot of power in getting to them. And then, of course, what we've already said, what are the challenges to this person on just meeting the basic needs? Sleep, nutrition, exercise, and how can I help you with that will go a long way in connecting with that person and their trauma.
Jamie.
So one of the things I do with my students in my introduction to counseling class, they're undergraduates, they're not counselors yet, they're thinking about becoming counselors, is I teach active listening skills. And it's very different than how we are typically with our friends or family members, because we're not very good listeners in general, because we're thinking about our own stuff. Like we have thoughts in our head, we're thinking about the next thing we're gonna say. That's when we jump into advice giving. We're not fully present with someone and really listening without thinking about what's next, what do I say, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I have all the solutions, I'm going to tell them everything now. So it's a skill, and I think journalists learning that skill is really helpful, because even hearing the panelists today, they said the journalists that approached them that really cared and showed that they cared, and I think I interpret that as listened. They weren't just asking their questions, but they paused and listened to what they wanted to say, had the most impact, and those were the journalists they wanted to talk to. So I think there's a really nice overlap with that idea, and I really think it is about learning those active listening skills of being present, and it's both verbal and nonverbal. So having open, body language, but really focusing in on what someone's saying and not just having your brain 10 steps ahead, which is hard for a lot of us.
I'm just going to ask all of you, and anyone leap in. I mean, it seems to me that would be difficult, because I'll speak only for myself. The rest of you, and I see a question. We'll come to a promise. When I hear something really, really disturbing, it's almost like a reflex for me to cross my arms and lean back a little bit. And at least from what I am hearing here, that's not going to be particularly helpful to, a colleague who is in great distress. So how do you discipline yourself, or how do you prepare yourself not to reveal? Kent, you seem to be the one leaning in, so I'm going to go to you while I walk.
Well, I was, even in the conversation in the last session, I felt myself tensing up just hearing some of the stories. Just hearing I can't imagine hiding in a closet with my students. I can't imagine being shot and still tackling the person. And so I wanted to acknowledge myself what that felt like in the moment. I try not to use the words "I understand" very often, because that person knows I don't understand fully and completely. I haven't been where they're at. And so I think it's acknowledging what's happening in the room. I have extensive training in motivational interviewing, which is a style of counseling where you pull out of the person what they're experiencing, what they're feeling. And a lot of it is just being able to be in the moment with what's happening in the moment. I also work with clients to go back to that moment when they experienced it and what was happening there. And just being able to do that brings out a lot of the truth there. I also take care that at the end of the day, that if I've had to shield myself some and wanted to put my arms up, how do I work myself out of that at the end of the day so that I'm not carrying all that home with me, and be keeping myself healthy through the process.
And I'm going to ask you, you don't have to give your full name, but just your first name so that they know with whom they're talking with, and then your question.
Okay. My name is Kay, and thank you for the thoughts you've shared so far. My question, I guess, thinking about processing traumatic events, either with other journalists or with a group of trusted people, I guess as journalists specifically, it feels like a lot of those traumatic events, professionally, there would be details that you can't share. And so how do you process that fully with somebody when I guess there are limitations to what you can share with them?
Stephen, I saw you start nodding your head up and down
Yeah.
first, so I'm going to give you the first crack at that.
I can relate a little bit. When I was over a hospital, I was the CEO of a hospital, which is a very lonely job. I was also the CEO of a VA hospital, a federal government hospital, who had a very close hold on all external messaging. And so there was a lot of that. I did a lot with my wife, that she's my trusted person. And so there were times where we would have to, number one, I'm downloading with her, and so it'd have to be are you at a good place where I can download my day, where I can talk about what has happened today, making sure that you give the other person that acknowledgement, something is about to come that's pretty heavy. But then also, I would say, like, counseling. That's the beautiful part of what all of these individuals do now or have done, is that there is a protected space, legally, there is a protected space where you can do that. And that is protected, which is really nice. And so don't abolish that thought right now that that's a weakness if you go to a counselor. I would highly encourage you throughout your career to always consider that as a possibility. I have been to a counselor in my life. It has proven great benefits, and I obviously they would promote that as well. But I think that's another really safe space that you can operate in.
Saw everybody nodding on the question, so whoever wants to jump in, please do jump in.
I just want to add real quick that you don't have to be a counselor. I think that's really important. So as we're talking about, like, being good listeners, and that is not your role, that's not your training, that's not the expectation, but just knowing that that's a valuable resource to point people to, I think is important.
That's important because Frank Ochberg, who's sort of the father of trauma journalism, when we started talking about having these symposia here on Franklin College's campus, said often journalists almost put themselves in the position of being therapists. And that's not their role. They don't have the training for it. Their job is to gather information, not to help, not necessarily to heal people. So, what are some, I'm going to take your question, your point there, Jamie, and say, what are some of the signs that you might be sliding over into a role if you're a journalist? If you're trying to police yourself on this, what should you be looking for?
Feel free to add in. I think if you are, in a situation where you feel overwhelmed, you feel like this is a lot, I'm not sure how to respond, I feel like this person needs more than I'm able to give, I mean, usually you will feel it like, oh, I'm out of my, I'm out of my depths here. I think, a lot of our students, are interested in the helping professions because they're already that person in their friend group that people come to with their problems. But I help them realize, like, you're not a counselor yet either. So just as you're learning these skills doesn't mean that you should go out and do that. I mean, it takes, it's a master's level profession for a reason. So there's additional training. Anything you would add to that?
Sarah, you?
Yeah.
I was making sure you knew there is a student with their hand up too.
Well, okay, Bessie, yeah, I'll come to you. Thanks.
My name is Bessie Kerr, and my question is, how do you communicate professionally with your team or boss that you're not okay?
It's a great question.
Very good question.
So I think I can go first because I kind of had something that I just wanted to say as part of something that was mentioned before. So we're talking, we were talking a second about counseling, and I just wanted to add to that I think there is a little bit of privilege assumed in being able to use counseling because it is expensive. So right now, if you're at an institution of higher education, it's very likely that you have the ability to go to your college counseling center and have that for free to you. I would be remiss if I did not mention EAPs in this conversation, so I think that's something for you to all just kind of mentally flag right now and to know. So it's EAP, it stands for Employee Assistance Program. So when you go out into your professional lives, and even now if you have a job, that's something that is oftentimes available to people as a benefit. So even if you're not on your company's insurance, it's a benefit that is given to all employees, and oftentimes employees and their immediate household members. So if you have a younger sibling who works at McDonald's, you have access to their EAP. If you have someone in your family who lives with you that they work at Starbucks, you have access to a really great EAP. So those kinds of things. And I think some of that is an important consideration too, that if you need some mental health benefits, that sometimes those are things to draw into and to consider. So just to know that even if your employer doesn't offer that kind of thinking and brainstorming in your family who might, that's still available to you. So what that is typically it is short-term counseling for a person to help them kind of get through and to get in a place to be better, to go back to work or that kind of thing, or to be the best selves at work. So it's not typically a long-term solution. At Franklin College, we have access to an EAP, and it is 3 sessions per year, which is not great necessarily. Our former one, it was 3 sessions per issue per year, so you could sort of manipulate that into getting free counseling for a year. Starbucks, I believe, is 20 sessions per year, so it just varies wherever your employer is. But I think that's something to keep in mind. Other people, there's, depending on what your religion is, your relationship with the church, or even just if you have access to a chaplain, that's another private space where people can have that ability to talk to someone. So I just wanted to mention that from the last conversation. And Bessie, what you just asked, I think is so important. And what we're talking about there is boundaries, which is one of my favorite things to talk to people about. And I'll let some others speak here in just a second, but I just want to honor what you're saying, because my heart and my counselor's soul is saying you need to set boundaries, and you need to say, I am not in an okay place right now, and I need this, or I cannot do this. But I also recognize that in the profession that might be setting yourself up for failure at times, right? So I'm kind of curious what you all think and what you have to say and kind of what some of your ideas are, as well as other people up here too.
Anyone else want to jump in on
I'd
that?
love to hear their opinion, but
Is that something that worries you, that you're going to, as, young journalists, that you're going to be sent out to cover something that has really got awful? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Marissa. Yeah, definitely that, and also just the idea of, I think a lot, like, am I really too tired to do this, to cover this, or am I just not working hard enough? And is it part of the job to just, suck it up and do it?
I'm smiling not because that had a real ring of familiarity to me, so, yeah.
Hi, my name's Mia, but kind of going off of what Marissa said, I also think with some of the job insecurity that comes with journalism, a lot of times, I know myself, I'm like, okay, if you can't suck it up, someone else will, and then take my position or take a possible job. And so I think that's an extra layer to it as well.
yeah.
Steve, I'm going to talk, because you have to structure, a work environment where presumably you are trying to create a space so that people can come and tell you, I'm not doing okay.
Right. Yeah.
What are steps in doing that?
Yeah, well, I may be tackling this from a different angle. Everything you just said, all three of you, just resonates with me. I mean, through, again, 20-year healthcare career, lots of employees I've walked through things with over the years. Let me just say that if you have an employer whom you cannot go to and say that, you're with the wrong employer. That may be hard to hear, because it's like, well, but it's a job, right? And you're looking at student loan debt coming up and everything else. But really, I mean, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his very soul? Like, what does it matter to keep that job or to ascend and look back and see that you are just a wreck of a human being? Like, it's not worth it. No job is worth that. And so consider carefully who you work for and those jobs you take. You want to be with an employer that would be heartbroken if you weren't able to come to them. That's the kind of atmosphere we try to create, which is like it always needs to be a safe place. And the thought about boundaries is a great one. It's like certainly you need to know where that point is and when you need to come forward. But I would offer that you need to work for somebody that would just die if they thought you didn't feel like you could come to them. So, sorry, that's kind of a back-ended way to come into that, but I think it's a really important statement.
It's important because it is part of the journey. Normally, I wouldn't insert myself into the conversation like this, but given that the fear is well-founded, because newsroom cultures, some of them are changing and adapting, but not enough. So I understand and would validate your fear. I guess, and I'll hand it off to the professionals, but as the journalist in the room, you do have an obligation to take care of yourself. It is just that simple. I had, and I promise this will be the last voyage into autobiography, but there was a period in my career when I was a newspaper journalist for the Indianapolis Star and Indianapolis News, where my editors discovered that families who had been victimized by drive-by shootings, and there were constant ones, it was during that period when drugs and guns arrived in metropolitan areas in force, realized folks would talk to me. So it seemed like every other day I was going out to talk to a grieving family or, a survivor of a drive-by shooting. I think the one that finally broke me was I had to go to a hospital and talk to an 8-year-old who'd been shot while his mother and grandmother were on the other side of the hospital bed, and I could just see them sobbing at what had happened to this little boy that they loved. And I had to go and talk to my editor and say, I need a break. Give me a while. I can't do this any longer. So you've got to give yourself permission, I think, to show that vulnerability and to acknowledge that you're going to be human at times. The job can't own you. It's that simple. Sorry. We'll hand it over to the people who actually know what they're talking about now.
Thank you, John, for sharing that. That's part of being able to listen to people is sharing your story at times. I was hired at MHP right after the country shut down with COVID, about 3.5 years ago. I stepped into a very quiet office, very little happening. What we discovered among our staff is that healthcare workers are notorious for taking care of other people. And they just keep doing that. And what we found out is they would have a crisis with a patient, and then the next patient was waiting. And so we simply started rounding on the 3rd floor of our hospital just so they could talk to us if they wanted. I would stop at a nurse's station and we would just chat. And then if they wanted to go into a further discussion, we'd pull them into, at that point, our physical therapy area had a spa. We didn't get in the spa, but that was the room where we had the counseling, which was great. And it allowed us to begin to do that. And in working with a respiratory therapist who has been very open with his story and is helping me on a panel in about a month, he said, I started going into the room and I knew I couldn't help this person. He said, I knew this person was going to die. And he said, it took away my purpose as a respiratory therapist. And he said, I had to draw back, and there was times he went to the stairwell to regroup himself. But he said, I knew I was too far when I didn't want to come into work anymore. I think that relates to what Steve said and you said, that you have to get to that point you realize what's changed. Am I still fulfilling the purpose? Because one of the things that each one of you will face in reporting is something we call moral injury. It's where we have these moments in our lives that what we believe and what we're reporting on may be in total conflict. And how you process that will determine whether it injures you internally or not, and beginning to build on that. So just be aware of those cues that your body will give you.
Sarah, Jamie, do either of you want to add something? Because I don't want to move on if you've got points you want to make on this.
I would just say, if you're in this for the long haul, you have to do the self-care because burnout is going to happen. And the high stress, high pressure of the field, and with how journalism has changed drastically so quickly, the self-care is kind of like absolutely essential for you to last in this career, I would think. I know it's the same for mental health workers. So I think it's really similar for journalists.
I want to pick up on something Kent said, and I'm trying to keep my eyes going in both directions, so if you do have a hand, also just feel free to call out, too, and I will come to you. But one of the things that struck me while you were speaking was really the idea of almost moral dissonance. You know, as journalists, we're trained not to make moral judgments, to suspend that part of, well, you know, it's the reason you can go out and talk to a murderer and not, you know, interview a murderer and not feel awful afterwards. It's part of the job. But you're right, doing that means that you, at some level, have to shut down your own value system for a little while. And you know, the phrase while you were talking that started running through my head was slow motion trauma. I mean, the fact that you're doing that over and over again. Are there coping skills? Because that is part of the job. The reality is that that's going to be part of it. Are there ways that these young journalists can begin preparing themselves for that part of it and establish regimens that help them care for themselves?
I think the first thing I'd recommend is start to network with people. As somebody had asked before, who do I talk to? Start developing a network of people in conferences like this, in your education, of who you can trust. And along with that is the level of someone who agrees with you on a lot of common things in your belief system. Because if your belief system is here, you need that support at the end of the day when that's been pulled and twisted and it doesn't make sense. You need a safe place to go back to express it's okay to still believe this way, even if I've had to deal with this and this and this. And I think having that support then allows you to go back and struggle with why do other people believe this way and still keep your own sanity and your own groundedness.
Jamie or Sarah, Steve, any of you want to add? So what steps should we take, picking up on, I think, the point that the three, to create newsrooms that are now more aware of trauma? I mean, what things so that, you know, I guess it's even Stephen's response, if there's a place that doesn't value and create that safe space where you should find another employer, you know, how should you create spaces in which people feel safe dealing with these things? Sarah, you made the mistake of making eye contact, so I'll go to you first.
Well, I think this is where it's important as someone who's interviewing for a potential position. I think just as much as it's an interview for yourself for a job, you want to be finding out if that's an appropriate employer for you, to speak to that point. So I think that, going into interviews prepared with the duties of the job and how you could perform that and how you could exceed in that role, but also really looking at that as, is this a good place for me to work? What is the culture? So even thinking about kinds of questions, and maybe these are things that would be better suggested by colleagues, but something that comes to mind for me is like, how will you support someone on their worst day? Or what does it look like in the newsroom on a really hard day? And just kind of get a vibe for what they're saying. I think talk is cheap a lot of times, right? So it might be possible that they say something and then you start working somewhere and you see that that's really not reflected in the culture. And that's then where you make decisions. Do you stay there? Do you continue? Do you go somewhere where you're appreciated and valued? That kind of a thing. But I think just kind of keeping that in mind in the interview process. And then I think when you're in that role, I can speak to this that here in my role here on this campus, that sometimes when I get down, when things feel really heavy, like my colleagues, we work really closely together and, are all confidential sources, and we find ways to bring our own joy. How can we get our morale up? Because I think really this is a conversation for the administrative and the executive level. Like, how do they create those places? Because more needs to be done to create that in newsrooms and lots of places and everywhere in our world. But I think sometimes you have to make decisions about how can we do this for ourselves? How can we create a space for ourselves? What can we do for fun after this? What can we do to distract ourselves? I mean, sometimes when you look at trauma, it's kind of like, you think about what should you do? Maybe that's in a week's time or in a month's time, those kind of things. But also like, what do I need to do tonight? Those basic things. But also sometimes like it's healthy to just distract yourself for a moment and, to go to dinner and we're not going to talk about work here. Or this is going to be a place that we are going to talk about work and we're going to get it all out and we're going to yell and holler and we're going to make some noise for a minute and then we're going to kind of like exhale and then we're going to keep going, whatever that is. But I think just kind of creating your space and finding your people that you can do that with is really helpful.
And yes, just a second.
Hi, I have a two-part question kind of related to all of that. Oh, I'm Salome. And so I'm an editor, and I'm wondering how can I make sure that I foster an environment where people can come to me if they say they need a break. So how do I balance like the work that needs to be done, but also letting people have a break and not overwork themselves? And then how do I reach out to someone if I think they might be overworking themselves and they might not realize it, but I think for the sake of their health, they could take a break or slow down.
Those are all great questions. Does anybody have anything?
No.
Well, that was kind of my thought when Sarah was talking, though, is that as young journalists, as you become editors, as you become in charge of newsrooms, you can be the change, right? You can be the people that your reporters can come to. So, I mean, it ties into what you're saying. How to do that is, I think, taking some of these tips, talking to people about how they've created that space. Yes, the work needs to be done, but are there ways that it can be done by someone else? What's really going to be like absolutely essential if this person is just not able to function? They're not going to be able to produce good work anyway, for the most part. So,
right, and sometimes work can be done in a different location too, right? So whether it, why don't you go to a place that you can kind of enjoy what your surroundings and that kind of a thing, a place that's comfortable and safe for you, and maybe that's a good place where you'll feel more supported. Or maybe it's, something that comes to mind for me too is when things aren't as hectic, maybe just like giving people space and checking in with them in those moments when you can especially take on some more work yourself to show them and kind of model that for them. In examples when it's not quite as high, in those moments where they're not so hot. But maybe even sometimes just having a group conversation, calling your whole staff together and how are we going to do this? And maybe it's in those kinds of moments where people might allow themselves to be vulnerable and to share, I can't do this right now. I have so much on my plate. And, I'm struggling with this and I can't take on this, whereas someone else might get excited about that opportunity or, so I think unless we're having conversations, to not make those assumptions for other people, that there might be other people that are willing to take on that work and might be excited about different aspects of it, but having a group conversation could facilitate that.
I want to pick up on the second part of Salome's question, which was, how do you look for signs if people are reporting to you? You're in a management position, what things should you be looking? Stephen, I can see that one's right in your wheelhouse. What are the things you look for to think, oh, maybe someone is struggling right now?
I mean, at the end of the day, most work environments have a lot of similarities in them. I would say a couple things. If you're in charge or you've been given authority over individuals that work for you, you know that the healthier they are, the better the product is. And so we focus on this a lot at our hospital, is that we want to create maximal flexibilities for our staff so that they are at their best every day. So they leave every day going, that was a great day. That was really good. And I was able to do this and accomplish this thing. And so what I would say is, if you notice that you have employees that you have come to just see consistency with, they're really good, but then something starts slipping, and only you know what that is, and I don't know what that would be. Is it misspelling? I don't know. But but if you see their work starting to slip, something's different. And so it really takes you being a student of your employees, a student of your peers, caring enough to be mindful of them, to notice that something is off. And then it comes down to having those honest conversations. I care about you. I'm noticing something is different. They'll be able to give you better words than I will, but being able to have those frank, honest, caring conversations, people want to know that the people around them care. And not to branch into this, but it's a relevant topic. One of the biggest misconceptions, as an example, around suicide is that I will cause a suicide if I ask somebody, are you suicidal? It's the exact opposite. The bringing it out into the light is actually the best way to prevent suicide. And it has, I would imagine, it has to filter downstream too. It's like people want to know that you noticed and that you care. And if you can create that example, it creates a really healthy work environment.
Steve, I'm going to pick up and redirect her, because I'll say I've been managing people and leading them for a long time. Having those kinds of conversations still makes me nervous. Sure. And how you approach them. So if you can offer them some counsel as to how you structure a conversation, how do you begin that with someone? What are the boundaries, to use the word that Sarah brought into the conversation appropriately? What things do you have to do as the initiator of that conversation?
We start our interviews with asking candidates, how do you take care of yourself? That was, Steve and I did an interview this morning, that was one of the questions. I have things now in my brain catalog, and eventually they'll get written down, of what this candidate, if we choose to hire her, is important to her. Her and Steve got on a conversation about goats and chickens and Airbnb. So I know those are passions that she has outside of what she'll ever do for MHP. So when I see things change, I'm going to say, when's the last time I heard about her goats? Or when is the last time I heard about her enjoying a guest at her Airbnb? And once we pull that into that, then I know, okay, something is different. It may be as simple as the work quality that goes into that. The other thing we've tried to do is be very sensitive, even in our interview process. If we choose to hire somebody, make sure we're getting them in the right position. We had a candidate that we hired about 3 months ago, doing great work, but she was ready to jump right into supervisory. And Steve and I both said, not quite. You've got some healing to do from your last job. And so we backed that down a bit. And so eventually she'll probably be there, but not now. So as you're choosing editors and choosing people to work underneath you, I think it's important to be aware of what are those things and are they ready for this or not. Sometimes it means some hard no's, because people sometimes think they can do more than they can. And that's where we help set boundaries, as Sarah had mentioned.
Thoughts, Jamie, Sarah?
I think just going back to the question of how do you ask that question. That's its own side 2-hour training that we could do. But I think in short, so suicide prevention is a passion area of mine. I teach QPR courses of how to ask people, question, persuade, refer. If people are suicidal, here in Johnson County, I respond to suicides. We get calls from the coroner, and I go to the scene and be with the family in those moments. So suicide is a passion area of mine, and we do that as a prevention measure because people who experience suicide loss by a loved one are then at a higher risk for suicide themselves due to being a part of that loss. So I think just in general, asking someone, as you mentioned, is important. I think having an idea of how to help someone in that moment, and you don't have to have all the answers. There's a 24/7 hotline that can help with that as well. It's now changed to 988. So I think just having that as a resource and calling that together if you need to, just knowing like we can Google things, we can look at this. But if you're going into a conversation and you know that you're going to be having it that day, that it's probably good to kind of do some work on the back end to kind of look into that. But I think as a whole, one takeaway about asking someone if they're suicidal is to not ask as a leading question. Like, you're not thinking about suicide, right? So I think in journalism, you probably talk a lot about leading questions, but that would be a way if you are concerned about someone and you do want to question that and let them know you notice things, to let them know that, but to not ask in that way, because it's clear in that moment that you're asking for a certain answer.
Because we're about to run out of time, I'm actually going to violate that rule and ask a leading question, because it's the quickest way to get to it. How important is it to suspend or dispense with any sort of quality of judgment? I was thinking, I did an interview over the air once with a therapist who worked with young children and said that the mistake many people would make was to ask, in effect, what's wrong with you, rather than something as simple as, what's happening with you right now, or what has happened in your life lately. That takes a lot of the sting and the shame out of the response. Sarah, again, you made the mistake of making eye contact.
Next time I'll bring some sunglasses or something. Does anybody else have anything to put to that? I think you touched it right there, right? I mean, there's a book, What Happened to You, and it talks about that whole translation of changing that verbiage to what's wrong with you to what happened to you, and there's a lot of work being done. And so I think just recognizing, again, the power of words like Kent spoke about. But I think that's acknowledgement of trauma in and of itself, like what has happened.
And oftentimes, it's how would I want the question asked to me? If I was feeling like I think this person might be experiencing, how do I put that in role play and almost switch gears? There's times in therapy that I've actually switched chairs, literally with patients, and said, you be the therapist. Let's role play this and see where it goes, helping you to understand what it feels like to be in their chair and asking those questions, because then I think we take a lot of the urgency of getting the question answered and more about hearing what the patient has to say.
Unless someone has a last question, I'm going to suggest that we thank our panel. Thank you very much. Very helpful conversation.